So real quick, something I want to talk about because I forgot to mention it, and I don't know where I'm going to throw this in the video, but something I want to talk about is, remember how I told you that, you know, for example, heroes will set up their spawn points below lows and villains will set up their spawn points above highs. And what both of these teams are looking to do is basically destroy each other, right? They're looking to wipe out the other team's spawn point. In this example, this group of heroes, let me zoom in a little bit for you. In this example here, this group of heroes right here was able to successfully wipe out this group of villains here, because we can see that we got a clear screenshot of how that battle went once this battle, so the candle, once this battle reached this villain spawn point, we can see that the heroes were able to take a screenshot of the fight and they closed past that villain spawn point, effectively telling us that the villains are no longer there. They've been wiped out. And you can see how significant the body on this candle, or you can see how significant the body of this screenshot is. Like, this is a really big screenshot in favor of the heroes past this point where these villains were set up at, right? So this is something called a break of structure in the trading world, and all it shows you is that, all it means is that, in simple terms, in video game terms, all it means is that villains or heroes have been wiped out, and a break of structure shows you that we are continuing to advance. That's all it means, okay? So a break of structure shows you that we are indeed advancing in the direction of the overall narrative. It is a group of heroes or villains that have been successfully wiped out, and we know they were successfully wiped out given a hero or a villain candle closing past the spawn point. Does that make sense? If that doesn't make sense, go back and watch it until it does, okay? Because that is as simple as it's going to get, I'm telling you. So, something else I want to talk about, because like I was going to make a whole video on like a break of structure, but we don't even need to do that. Like, I literally just explained to you what a break of structure was. That's all it is. If a screenshot of heroes closes past a spawn point of villains, well, that candle that closed past that spawn point, from where that spawn point originated from to where that candle closed, that line, that hard draw line between the two, that is the break of structure. What this break of structure, so what this line, what it tells you is that we are indeed advancing, leveling up, we're collecting XP, we are indeed advancing in favor of the heroes. That's all a break of structure tells you. And it's vice versa for the sellers, right? So if we have a group of heroes, and then we have a group of villains, right? And the villains are able to get past the spawn point of heroes. The candle that closed past the spawn point and where the spawn point originated from, the line between those two is the break of structure, okay? So all the break of structure tells you is that we are indeed advancing in favor of the villains. That's all a break of structure tells you, okay? You don't need to get too caught up on break of structures. None of that matters. The only thing that matters is context. Do you know who sits above highs, and do you know who sits below lows? And who's taking out who? That's all that matters. That's all you need to understand. But I just still wanted to show you what a break of structure was, because I was going to make a whole video on it, but you don't even need a whole video on it, because like it's simple, bro. Okay? So I want you to write down in your notes that a break of structure is where a spawn point originated from to where a opposing villain or hero candle closed past that spawn point, okay? Another thing that is important that you can write as like a PS or a side note underneath that is that the significance of the screenshot, or the significance of the candle closing past the spawn point, shows you how serious the villains or the heroes were at that point in time about taking out those group of villains or those group of heroes. Does that make sense? Okay, that is as simple as it's going to get. I truly believe That is it, bro. I used to watch videos on like break of structure and I was so confused about it. You no longer need to be confused. Okay, we already went over it. Find this, mark up the spawn point, mark up the spawn points. Okay. Mark up the spawn points. Mark up who's sitting below those spawn points. Is it villains? Is it villains or is it heroes sitting below those spawn points? Once we close past one of those two areas, okay, understand the candle that breaks past, in this example, this candle here, understand that from the spawn point, so draw a line from the spawn point to where that candle is, that line is a break of structure. And the context behind that line, and the context behind that break of structure line, all it's telling you is that we are indeed advancing in favor of the heroes. That's all it tells you. So you need to understand that vice versa. So we found the two spawn points. If the villains were able to move past the hero spawn point, the screenshot, or the candle in trading terms, the screenshot that closes past where the spawn point originated from to the candle that broke past, that hard line between those two, that is the break of structure. And what that line tells you is that we are indeed advancing in favor of the villains or of the heroes. Okay? Don't overcomplicate it. That is what a break of structure is. So anywhere you see that on a chart, that's all that means, okay? I can mark that up all day. Here we can see that the heroes broke past this villain spawn point. So this line tells us that we are indeed advancing in favor of the heroes. Here we broke past a spawn point of heroes. So from that hero spawn point to the candle that broke it, we are indeed advancing in favor of the villains. That is all a break of structure is. And that is important because given the context, because if we're in an overall, so if we're in an overall move up, what is it that we want to keep seeing? If we are in an overall move up, we want to keep seeing the villain spawn points get taken out. So we want to keep seeing break of structures to the upside. We want to see villain spawn points keep getting destroyed. Okay? Don't overcomplicate it. That's all it means. So write that down. Write down a break of structure is what I just told you. And then write down the context that the break of structure gives you. The context of a break of structure is it just shows you that we are indeed advancing above or below that line in favor of whoever broke it. That's all it means, okay? It shows you that whoever moved past that spawn point, they won. That's all it's showing you. All right. So, like I said, I just wanted to quickly explain that to you because it's not a difficult topic to absorb. It is a difficult thing to get used to seeing with your eyes, but that's where you're going to go apply what I'm showing you and practice on your own, or none of this matters. It is an easy concept to absorb. Especially with the way that I've just broken it down to you, okay? Another thing that I want to add on to that is you have to understand this. XP, or in trading terms, liquidity, XP explains why we are moving in a certain direction, and then the break of structure shows you that we indeed did move in that direction. That is all it means. Keep it simple. Don't overcomplicate it, okay? So write down what I just said. XP explains why we are moving in a certain direction, and a break of structure shows us that we indeed did move in favor of that direction. That's all it shows in the video game, okay? All right, welcome to the next video. I am extremely tired. However, we're gonna keep this going, okay? So, what we're gonna talk about in this video is something in trading known as a FVG, a fair value gap. Support and resistance, I call it S&R for short, and volume profile. With these three things, these are essentially going to be your weapons in this video game, okay? Now, keep in mind, Your weapons that you choose in this video game can be whatever you choose for your weapon to be. There is no label on what a weapon can or cannot be. It is simply what you're able to execute your attacks with. And you attacking in this game is you placing a buy or sell order. We haven't got into how to attack yet. So just slowly roll. For now, let's talk about what a fair value gap is. FVG for short. In video game terminology, a fair value gap is simply a opening in price. In video game terminology, a fair value gap is simply a opening in battle for you as a player to return to restock up on weapons, gear, and more allies. And if you return to that opening or that gap in battle where you're able to get gear, weapons, and allies, and you are successful in retreating back to that area, you can then move away from that area and then continue advancing towards your enemy. Does that make sense? Now we can shorten down that description, but I just want you to understand what a FVG is first. So let's talk about SNR now, aka support and resistance. What support and resistance is, in video game terminology, is simply an area that heroes or villains get to and they check out. It is a checkpoint. And every time they get back to that area, that hero or villain, they reach that checkpoint, they either have the option to go through and create a new checkpoint, or they get to that checkpoint and they turn around and they are turned around by either a boss battle or by a opposing group, an opposing enemy. And if you're still confused, that is fine. We're going to explain these more in depth on the chart once again. The last thing I want to talk about is something known as a volume profile. It is extremely easy. When I pull it up on the screen, don't get intimidated by it. We are going to simplify it. A volume profile in video game terminology is simply a tool that allows you to see where potential boss battles might be sitting at within the game. And it also shows you where a majority of the fighting is happening within the game. That the context for those two things is very important, because if we know where the bosses are sitting at in the game, well, when we reach those areas where the boss fights, the big boys that move the game a lot more than we do, when we reach those areas where they're sitting at, we have the opportunity to take advantage of the fact that they're probably about to wipe out all the other players in the boss room, and everybody gets wiped and they all drop their XP, but not you, because you knew where they were sitting at. That is simply all it is. And then it gives us the context of, well, since the boss has wiped everybody out inside of that boss room, and now the boss is controlling the narrative, right? And the boss can either be a hero, it can be a hero boss, or it can be a villain boss. So it can be going up or down, it doesn't matter. Just like you, the boss fight is going to be attracted to where a majority of the players are fighting at, because that is where he wants to go, because that is where the XP is at. Okay, so one more time, the volume profile just shows us potential areas where boss fights might be sitting at, and then it shows us a majority, it shows us a point on the battlefield where a majority of the players were potentially fighting at. That is all it shows us. It gives us context, okay? So now that we have an understanding of what those three things are, and you can write that stuff down if you're able to, we're gonna give a better description after we explain what these things are on the chart and how to identify them. But for right now, let's jump into reading where a FVG is, a fair value gap. That is the one we're going to start with. Let's read where it's at. Let's get the context. Okay, so starting out, let's go to a random spot on the chart. I will show you how easy this is to identify. I'm going to look away from the screen and fucking go back to a random time, and we are going to find what. Just watch. So I'm not looking, so let me turn around. I got a wireless mouse, right? Gonna turn around and I'm gonna use it. Okay. So as you can see, I wasn't looking. We've gone to a random point in time. Look how easily I can zoom in and identify areas where Price potentially wanted to return to seek support from allies. It is extremely easy. And the reason I'm turning around and I want to show you, and I just did that, is because that is how good you should get at. This is how easy it is to identify a fair value gap. It is not hard. So when we go over this, you should be able to turn around, scroll to a random spot on your chart, and be able to mark these up, okay? And I'm going to show you how. And then I'm going to do it again. And then I want you to do it, okay? So let's simplify this. Once again, so a fair value gap for the hero side, it consists of 3 candles. It does not matter the size of the candles. It does not matter how long the wick is of the candle. It doesn't matter. I will show you the only thing that matters, okay? In the context of heroes, so we're in a hero narrative, okay? A fair value gap consists of 3 candles. Okay? It consists of 3 candles. And these red things are the wicks on the candle. So they're these long pointy things, okay? Once again, it does not matter how small they are. It does not matter how big they are, okay? It does not matter. Okay. So this is our 3 candle formation. Let's say we have a hero candle, so a candle going up, and then we have another hero candle going up, and then all of a sudden we have a candle that closes in favor of the villains, okay? Once again, it does not matter. The only thing that matters in this 3 candle formation is the fact that it was going upwards, and while it was going upwards, it left a gap inside of the battlefield. So remember, each of these candles is just a screenshot of the amount of time it took between villains and heroes to fight. And the color of that screenshot shows you who won that fight in that amount of time by the time that screenshot is finished printing. So by the time this one closes and this one opens up, this is a finished screenshot, and this one is just now beginning to form until another one opens up where this is the finished screenshot, okay? That is important. So in the amount of time it took these 3 candles to form, while these guys were fighting, it left a gap in the battlefield from here to here. Do you see the gap? So here, let's make these lines a different color so they're a bit easier to see. It left a gap in the battlefield while they were fighting. Now, once again, it doesn't matter what color the candles are. It doesn't matter how long the wicks of the candle are. It doesn't even matter how small the candle is. So if this candle here was like super small like this, and like the wick was super long, it does not matter. The only thing that matters is that these 3 candles formed. So they completed, they're not moving anymore. They formed, and it left a gap in the battlefield, okay? Do we all got that down? Okay, so we'll talk about the gap in a second, but I need you to understand that. Now let's do that in context of a villain narrative, okay? So it is the same thing. It is a 3 candle formation, but this time we're moving downwards, all right? Once again, it does not matter how big the candlesticks are, how small they are, how big the wicks are. So as these candles were moving downwards in battle, which tells us what? That tells us that inside of this candle, the villains had won by the time it closed. That tells us that inside of this candle, the villains have won by the time it closed. Inside of this candle, who won? Heroes won inside of this candle, okay? The candles closing and their color gave us context. But for a fair value gap, that context does not matter, all right? The only thing that matters is that the formation of these 3 candles during the time they were fighting from here to here, they left a gap in price. They left a gap on the battlefield That is the only thing that matters, okay? So don't ask any, don't be scared to ask questions, okay? It's fine. But you should not be asking, oh, well, does it matter if the wick does it matter if the wick's like super small? No, bro, it doesn't matter, okay? If there is a gap between these 3 candles, that gap is the only thing we are interested in, okay? Now, let me show you something that isn't a gap. So if we have this same 3 candle formation, but the wick comes all the way down here, is there a gap? Is there a gap anymore? Can you see a gap? Between these 3 candles, is there a gap? No, there is no gap. There is no like missing void space here. Right? This came down and filled it all. You see that? There is no gap to fill anymore. From here to here, there is no gap. Do you see that? Same thing if we're looking at it backwards. If this candle were to move all the way up here, and by the time it closed, it left this giant wick like this, is there a gap here anymore? No. Okay? If this wick were to move all the way down here and cover this entire area, is there a gap here anymore? No. There is no gap. There's nothing there's no gap from here to here. There is no gap, okay? Is there a gap there now? Yes. You can physically draw lines where the gap exists at. Do we all got that down? Does that make sense? Okay? Now that you know how to find the gap, so how do we find the gap? It is a 3 candle formation, okay? It takes 3 candles to form the gap. It doesn't matter their size. It doesn't matter the wick. The only thing that matters the only thing that matters in return to the wick is, does the wick cover the second candle's body? Because if it covers the area of the second candle, or of the second screenshot, if we're talking in video game terms, if it covers the screenshot of the second candle, there is no gap. There is no gap in the screenshot. The picture has been filled, right? Okay, so now that we understand that, let's go back to this narrative. So what this means basically, context-wise, is that why these villains and heroes were fighting inside of these candles. During this candle, when the fighting was going on, the heroes were so overwhelming versus the villains. So the heroes are putting belt to ass while they're fighting the villains. They were so overwhelming, they didn't even give they didn't even take a break. Okay, so one more time. The heroes were so overwhelming on this candle. The heroes were so overwhelming that they didn't even give the villains a chance to breathe. They didn't give themselves a chance to breathe. Okay, so essentially what this becomes, this gap, this area here, essentially what this area here becomes is a void. Okay, but in video game terms, what this area becomes is a market for the heroes to return back to stock up on more gear. So essentially what we want to see is, since they've moved up and they did so in such an overwhelming way here, they didn't give themselves a chance to breathe. As this group of villains step in here up at the top to push this group of heroes back down, they're essentially able to catch themselves here and try to recruit more allies and try to recruit more help. They're trying to recruit more help so that they can continue moving upwards to then take out that group of villains. Does that make sense? Stick with me now. The only way you'll understand what I just said is if you physically draw it out yourself. So get a piece of paper and draw it out with yourself. Draw out what it is I'm drawing here so that you can understand, okay? Write your own little notes next to everything, okay? So now let's look at that from the side of villains. So this is a overwhelming villain move going down, okay? So context-wise for this 3 candle formation, as these villains and heroes were fighting inside of these candles, during this candle here, the villains were so overwhelming. They were overwhelming the heroes so much that they didn't take a break, right? They didn't take a break here. They gained so much ground here. There was no problem for them to gain so much ground here. How do we know that? Because the heroes weren't able to fill in this area, right? If the heroes were able to fill in this area, we would have gotten a candle or a screenshot, we would have gotten a screenshot moving up like this, right? It would have moved up and filled that area, because then that means they were fighting back. Or this screenshot would have closed the opposite color, so it would have been a heroic candle instead. So does that make sense context-wise? So look, one more time. The villains that are fighting these heroes and winning in this context here, they were so overwhelming on this candle that they were able to set up all of this ground here. They were able to set up all of this extra ground here for themselves. You can call it a shop. They were able to set up a shop here for themselves. It is a black market, okay? They were able to set up a market here for themselves, right? So by the time, once we keep moving down, by the time a hero spawn point decides it wants to step in and start trying to move the narrative back up to challenge this group of sellers who pushed them down in the first place, right? Once they get to that market, well, you have to think this was an area where villains gained so much ground. There are a bunch of villains living in here now and basically like 0 heroes. So this is like, bro, this is like trying to storm a Roman castle or a Persian castle way back then. You're not getting through. You're not Trojan horsing your way into this area, okay? It would take an overwhelming amount of force in order to get through this area. In fact, that is possible, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But for right now, you have to understand that there is a village of villains living within this gap. They were able to set up so much land here. So since the heroes see that, do you think they're going to have it easy at that area in time, or do you think they're going to struggle at that area in time? They're probably going to struggle. And what does a hero struggling look like in terms of screenshot? Moving back down. So from that area, you will begin to see the heroes get pushed back down. Okay? Does that make sense? So that is from the narrative of villains winning. So price is moving down. And from the narrative of heroes winning, they were able to gain so much ground that they set up their own little village within this gap here, right? So by the time a group of villains look to spawn back in to challenge these group of heroes that had pushed them all the way up here, once they reach that village, once they reach that gap, they're not going to have it easy getting past that gap. It would take an overwhelming amount of force for them to get past that gap, right? So since they're not going to have it easy, the heroes are going to begin to push them away, right? Does that make sense? Okay, I hope that makes sense. So now that you understand that, let's see what that looks like on a chart. Now, you can follow along with me and just look at the date where my mouse is once I zoom in here. But we can literally zoom in anywhere where price, so anywhere where we can literally zoom in anywhere. This happens all the time, okay? So I'm just gonna zoom into a random spot. If you wanna follow along, you can look at the date where my mouse is currently at, and we'll go from there, okay? So we can see that this narrative is it's going up, right? Which means that it is a hero narrative, okay? During a hero narrative, what does a fair value gap consist of? 3 candles. And within those 3 candles, a gap between those 3 candles. So here we have 1 candle, 2 candle, and 3 candles, okay? Do you see that? And within those 3 candles, so from here to here, you can see that there is a gap between these 3 candles, right? Do you see that gap? Okay. So if we mark that gap up, right, from here to here, and if you're wondering how to mark the gap up, really there is no specific way. But how I mark it up is from the top of the wick to the bottom of the 3rd candle's wick, okay? It doesn't matter though. Just mark it up from the top of the candle to the top of the other candle, okay? Like, you don't need to get real specific, but this is how I do it, okay? You just need to be able to identify where this gap is. So let's mark up where the gap is. It's right here, okay? Let's make it a different color so you guys can see what it is I'm looking at. We'll make it blue because that is the color of good guys. And for number's sake, we're gonna put 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so you can see we have 3 candles here. And within those 3 candles, we have this huge gap. So now let's read the context behind this, okay? So inside of this candle that left the gap, because realistically that's the only one we care about here in terms of context, within that candle what had happened is that the heroes were so overwhelming as they were fighting the villains that they did not give the villains a chance to breathe at all. And since that happened, that gap is where the heroes were able to set up a hero village, okay? Or you can think of it as this is where heroes were able to set up shop. They were able to set up a market here, a hero market, okay? So, since the heroes were able to set up a market here, if the villains are ever to bring themselves back down to this point in time where the heroes didn't even let them breathe, what realistically do we want to happen here at this moment in time? Well, think about it. Use your logic, right? If the heroes couldn't even push themselves below this area when they were fighting there originally, why would they be able to then later return to that area and then be able to break it, right? There is a whole village here. Now, keep in mind, it doesn't mean they can't do that, but what we want to see is the villains return to this area and then get rejected by the heroes. And we want a group of heroes to respawn in at this area where the villains have gotten rejected before. Does that make sense? Okay, so if I play the battlefield now, if I play the tape, so if I let the video game play now, I want you to pay attention to this area once the villains are able to push back down into it, okay? So let me get this off of the screen for you. So watch as the villains try to come back down to that area. Do you see what happened there? They were able to come all the way back down, back to that area. And as they came back down to that area, a group of heroes spawned in there. Why did a group of heroes spawn in there? Because they have a village set up inside of this entire area. Why do they have a village set up? Because they were so overwhelming that during this number 2 candle, they were so overwhelming that they didn't even give the villains a chance to fight back, which means the only people that exist there are heroes, right? So if the villains ever come back to that point, heroes have no problem spawning back in because they're already there. In fact, it is hero spawn heaven, okay? So we can see this group of heroes spawn in at the bottom here. How do we know that? Because the heroes drag themselves all the way back down and they immediately get turned around. And now the heroes are taking the fight back to the villains. They're taking the fight back to the villains who had started, right? Because villains exist above highs. They're taking the fight back to the villains who started this move down in the first place. So they're like, oh yeah, you're going to try to move towards us? And they're like, no. And they take that fight back to them, effectively wiping them out. How do we know they get wiped out? Remember the break of structure thing we talked about? This candle closes past the spawn point of those sellers who move price down to challenge them in the first place, right? And as we can see, heroes continued to thrive above that area, okay? Does that make sense? Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. The only way you're going to understand this is if you, one, practice it yourself. So what I want you to practice doing is going and finding 3 candles, mark up 1, 2, 3, and ask yourself, okay, on the second candle, is there a gap in between price? How do we know if there's a gap in between price? Because from the top of the candle or the top of the wick, if there is a gap there, then yes, there's a gap in between prices. Like you see how there's a gap right here. It's very small, but this is a gap in price, okay? So now let's do it from the villain side of things, okay? This happens so much, I'm just gonna go back literally like that. So as we can see, the overall narrative is going down, which means it is favoring villains, right? So I can literally, this happens so much, I can literally zoom in here, okay? And I can see, okay, actually I see something else. So we're not going to talk about that yet because I want to teach you that as well. I can see where it is that gap is. So remember, a fair value gap consists of 3 candles, and on the second candle, you want a gap between those 3 candles. So here we have 1, 2, 3. From this candle to this candle, is there a gap within that space? Yes. You can literally draw in between these 2 lines. If I wasn't able to draw in between these 2 lines, that's not a gap, okay? You should be able to draw a squiggly line in between the 2 lines, okay? Now, what does this mean context-wise? What does this mean context-wise? It is the same thing, but backwards. All it means is that as this was moving down on the candle where the gap is, all that means is on the screenshot where that gap is that the villains were so overwhelming that they didn't even give the heroes the time of day, like, at all. They were so overwhelming in this period of time that they were able to set up a villain village or a villain shop within that gap. Anytime you see a gap on a 3 candle formation, I want you to think basically there is a village of heroes or villains there, okay? That is all you need to think. Any gap you see on a 3 candle formation, that is what that means. So we have our context. A group of villains have claimed this land as theirs, right? So what does that mean for the heroes if they're ever able to get back to this area? What should that mean realistically? Well, will it mean that heroes should jump right through it? Like it doesn't matter? No. What should happen, since villains didn't give the heroes the time of day, and instead they claimed all this land for themselves, that means there are villains camping here waiting for heroes to get back up there and challenge them, okay? So if the heroes ever return to that area, what should realistically happen is they should immediately get turned around and start getting pushed away from that villain village, okay? That is all that means. So now let's watch as the battle plays out. Let's see what happens when the battle gets back to this area in time. Boom. So look, the heroes have made contact. The heroes have made contact with that village of villains. So what do we want to see happen here to the heroes? First of all, you have to ask, okay, who holds the power within the gap? It is the villain. Why is it the villain? Because on that candle that created the gap, on that candle where the gap exists, the context behind that is that the villains were so overwhelming when they were fighting the heroes. They overwhelmed the heroes so much that they didn't even give them a chance to fight back. So they were able to set up a villain village or a villain shop between that gap area. So now we have a bunch of villains camping within that area. Okay? So what should happen to these heroes is they should immediately get pushed away. Damn. The reason these heroes got pushed away immediately is because there is a camper here. There was a group of villains camping here at this point, waiting for those heroes to get up there and challenge them. That is all that means. That is what a fair value gap is, okay? Everybody got that. So at the end of all of this, we're going to tie all the context together, because what we haven't tied into this is, look, oh, I don't want to talk about it yet. We're not going to talk about it yet. Okay. So you understand what a fair value gap is now. It is just an area where heroes or villains were so overwhelming that they were able to set up a shop, or they were able to set up a village where they have allies, weapons, everything they need, so that if the opposing force comes back to that area at a point in time, they should immediately get turned around, because there is just such an overwhelming force right there in that area. Now, what we're going to talk about next is if heroes or the villains reach a area where they're supposed to get turned around, but instead they bust right through it. Okay, that is what we're going to talk about next. So let me introduce you. I've already introduced you to the idea of what a fair value gap is. Now let me introduce you to the idea of what a inverse fair value gap is what we would call it in the trading community. Okay, all a fair value gap is, all a inverse. So definition of inverse, right? So if we have a fair value gap and now we have a inverse fair value gap, what does inverse mean? It is just the opposite, right? So it is the opposite of a fair value gap. So think about this. If we have a gap in price and a fair value gap is supposed to move a opposing force away, what do you think it is that a inverse fair value gap does? What is the opposite of moving something away? If you said continuing, you would be correct, okay? So now what we're going to look at is essentially this. So this is a inverse fair value gap now, okay? And essentially what we're going to look at now is we want to see, instead of moving away, instead what happens is the opposing force moves through it, back to it, and then instead of going down, they go up. So does that make sense? So a fair value gap pushes away, a inverse fair value gap continues, okay? That's all that means. Now let me show you this on a chart. Okay, so here we have a overall narrative going up, right? We can clearly see that this is going upwards. Okay? Here we have our one, oh my God, I wish this would stop happening. Here we have our 1, 2, 3 candle formation. Okay? We have a 3 candle formation. Remember where it is that we want to look for the gap? On the second candle. Is there a gap on that second candle? Yes. From here to here, there is a gap, and we want to extend this. Okay? So, what is it that we want to see happen at this gap? If you said we want to see the villains return to this area and get pushed away, you would be correct. Why is that? Because there is a overwhelming amount of heroes inside of this area. So what happens if the villains are able to get through that area at that time? Let's talk about it. So here we can see an overwhelming amount of villains step in and just completely disrespect this area where they were supposed to get turned around at. Essentially what happened to these heroes here that were camping at this shop or at this village is they all got slaughtered, bro. They're gone. They're gone, Joe. Okay? There's just bodies everywhere. That's all you need to understand. If that area, if that gap gets broken, understand that there is no more heroes there. The only people that exist there now is the complete opposite. It is the inverse. The only people that exist there now are villains. Villains exist there now within inside of that gap. You sticking with me? So what is it do you think should happen if the heroes, right? Because it would be the heroes fighting back now. What do you think it is should happen if the heroes decide to try to bring the battle back to these guys who had pushed them down? What do you think is going to happen to the heroes at this moment in time once they try to climb their way back up here and fight these guys? They should reach that area, theoretically. They should reach that area and they should get pushed away, right? Think about it. Are you sticking with me? The reason they should get pushed away, once again, one more time, before what we wanted to see happen was villains return to this area, and then we wanted to see the villains get pushed away. Instead, the complete opposite happened. We had such an overwhelming force of villains that the villains were able to break that area, right? They were able to break that area at that moment in time. They were able to break that area, And now when a new group of heroes spawn in, at the bottom, they're going to look to try to take that fight back to those guys who bullied them and took all of their stuff from them, all their village. They want to get rid of the guys who just did that to them. So as they're coming back up to fight those guys, well, we no longer have heroes camping in this village. They've been conquered. USA, USA, USA. Let me stop. But they've been conquered, and the only people that exist there now are the villains, because they took that land from them by force. So now, when the heroes get back to that area at whatever point in time, what we want to see is them get pushed away from that area. And as you can see, this is even better. They tried to come back up there, but did not work. But look, we want to see what happens as soon as they re-reach this area. So we're going to continue. We'll drag it all the way over here. Oh, we're about to make contact. Oh, complete opposite happened, actually. So here the narrative switched. And I already showed you how you can tell when a narrative is switching. We can literally, let's do it real quick, actually. Here the narrative was going down. How do we know the narrative was going down? Because they destroyed this revenge camp of buyers here. So the narrative was to the villain side, and then all of a sudden we have this group of heroes step in here. They then wipe this group of villains out, right? So then these villains that spawn in here try to get revenge, but then they are completely obliterated by this group of heroes. So this has officially changed to the narrative of heroes. So when the heroes re-reached that point, they had no problem getting through it because they hijacked the narrative from the villains. So although the villains controlled this area that they once took from them, they had no problem retaking it because they already hijacked the overall narrative. Okay, now I know that was a bit off topic, but that's why that happened. So instead of us getting back to that area and rejecting off of it, instead the buyers just retook control of it. And that is something else we were going to talk about, but I don't want to confuse you guys. So let's go find an example of a hijacked fair value gap and the sellers taking advantage of it. Okay, so I found a perfect example. If you want to follow along with me, I'm starting on Monday, the 5th of May, 2025, and we are on the gold futures COMEX chart, okay? So here we have a 3-candle formation. Let's mark this up. We have 1, 2, and we have 3. We have 3 candles. And on that second candle, that's where the gap should exist. Is there a gap? Yes, we can physically see a gap. So within this gap, since there was such an overwhelming amount of heroes inside of this gap, this should be a gap where the heroes maintain control at all times, right? Because they have set up a village there. They have set up a hero village. So what we want to see, like we were talking about, is the villains return to this area and immediately get rejected. In fact, we do see that actually happen. We see that happen here, right? The villains brought themselves back down and they immediately got rejected, right? And they immediately got taken out of the game. Do you see that? So now, if at any point overall price returns to this area, what we want to see happen is it get rejected off this area. Now, if the complete opposite happens and instead this area gets pillaged, it gets pillaged by the villains. So that's what just happened. How do we know that happened? Because we had an overwhelming amount of villains step in, because it takes an overwhelming amount of power, right? We had an overwhelming amount of villains step in and completely take this land from these heroes. So now this has officially turned into villain territory. We'll do red. This has officially turned into villain territory. So theoretically, what we want to see happen is price come back to this area and then continue downwards, because it is the inverse of a fair value gap. Remember that. Fair value gaps keep price moving. Fair value gaps, what they do is we want to see price come back to them and then reject price, right? the inverse of that, it is the complete opposite. We want price to come back to it and reject it, but for the opposing team, right? This is now stolen land. So the heroes no longer own this land because the villains were able to close underneath this land and just murdered everybody. There are no more heroes in this village, right? The heroes can try to reclaim the land, like we can see happen here. They try to reclaim, right? They tried to reclaim this land here. But ultimately, what we want to see happen is for those heroes to fail despite their best efforts, which is what we just seen there. So one more time. This is a hero fair value gap, okay? What we want to see is this is an area where if price, or where if the fight comes back to it, it rejects the villains and it only helps the heroes push the villains away. We don't want to see it help the villains. If this is a hero fair value gap, we do not want to see it help the villains. However, if the villains are able to get underneath that gap, it then becomes stolen land and it turns into villain territory now. So then what we want to see is the villains keep the heroes underneath that area, okay? Now, we just seen before, though, the heroes still have the opportunity to try to regain control and take that land back, just like in a video game, just like in like a war, right? If you say we're in a war and somebody takes your land from you, you can still fight back. It doesn't mean you'll succeed, but you can still fight back. So it is the same concept. The heroes can still fight back. However, it doesn't mean they'll succeed. In this example, they did not succeed. They weren't able to close a hero candle above that area. Do you see that? So that is what we want to see, okay? And anything underneath that area, what we want to keep seeing is price return to that area, and we want to see the heroes keep getting rejected. If the heroes are able to get through it, then that means that the heroes have regained control of that land. As we can see, they were not able to do that, and we haven't even talked about this. Yeah, these heroes were getting their butt spanked, bro. The villains were just putting belt to ass. They were putting belt to ass, bro. They were putting straight belt to ass. So that is what an inverse fair value gap is from the hero's perspective. I can't remember if we talked about the inverse fair value gap from the villain's perspective. I don't think we did. Let's talk about it. If I did, I'll just cut it out or something. But okay. So the inverse fair value gap from the villain's perspective, in fact, this is my favorite one, is something a little like this. So we have our three candle formation, 1, 2, 3. Okay. Where should the gap exist? It should exist on the second candle. We can see physically that there is a gap here, right? We can see that, okay? We already know the context of why that gap exists in the first place. I'm not going to keep explaining it. There is a villain village set up there. So since this is a fair value gap, what we want to see happen is the heroes attempt to try to bring the fight back to these guys here, and we want to see them fail. And the reason they fell is because a group of villains are spawn camping this area. That is what we want to see happen. However, if this group of heroes is able to get through that area, is it any longer a fair value gap? No, it is now a inverse fair value gap. It is the opposite, meaning this is stolen land. The land has been stolen. This is no longer villain land. This land now belongs to the Ginyu Force. No, this land now belongs to the heroes, okay? So what we want to see happen, theoretically, is for the villains to attempt to bring the fight back to that group of heroes that took their land from them, and we want to see them get completely rejected, offer denied. So let's see if that happens. Boom. Here the villains attempt to bring the fight back to that group of heroes that caused them to lose that land in the first place. And as they do that, they immediately get pushed away by all of the new heroes spawn camping on their new stolen land. Now, do you see the giant wicks that came down underneath that stolen land there? it doesn't matter. If the candle doesn't close underneath that area, so if we don't get a screenshot, meaning if this candle that tried to come down here, if it doesn't fully close underneath that area, it does not matter. In trading, these are known as rejection wicks. They got rejected. That is where they got rejected. The villains tried to bring themselves all the way down here. Ultimately, they were pushed away back above that area. So that is valid stolen land. So this is where you could look to join the team of the hero. Until, like you just seen, until the villains retake control of that land, right? And this just keeps happening. Now, eventually, at some point, this where this stolen land is at, it will become void and you want to update it, right? And what I mean by update it is why all of this is forming. It is creating new and fresher gaps that are more relative than this gap all the way back here. Okay, I would say this gap, or a gap in general, becomes completely irrelevant. Well, a inverse fair value gap becomes irrelevant if the sellers are able to regain control of it. So in this example, we have a seller. So in this example, we have a villain fair value gap that got inverted and turned into a hero inverse fair value gap. This becomes completely irrelevant if the villains are able to bring themselves back underneath that inverse fair value gap. If that happens, just throw it away. You don't need it anymore. Does that make sense? Same thing from the buyer's perspective, okay? If we have a buyer, so if we have a buyer fair value gap, right? And it gets inversed and turned into a villain inverse fair value gap, and the buyers are able to regain control back above that inverse fair value gap, just throw it away. It's outdated and you don't need it anymore because it's not going to do what it was supposed to do, okay? So there's a little rule for you. So write that down, by the way. So what I just said, write that down because that's important. So to wrap all of this up, we have talked about fair value gaps and we have talked about inverse fair value gaps. This is definitely going to be its own video because I've been recording for about an hour now. That is a lot of editing. And yeah, I mean, it's literally as simple as that, guys. So let's wrap up here for a second and let's recoup. So I hope you were taking notes and following along. So one more time. A fair value gap consists of 3 candles. It does not matter the size of the candles. A fair value gap consists of 3 candles. There should be a gap in between. The gap exists on the second candle. You should be able to draw in between these 3 candles. If you can't draw in between the 3 candles, it's not a fair value gap. Okay? When is this not a fair value gap? If at any point a wick of one of those screenshots or one of those candles come down and cover the body of the second candle, it's no longer a fair value gap. There is no gap. There's no gap. You can literally see there's no gap. It doesn't matter what wick does it. If any wick does that, it's not a fair value gap, okay? We want to see a clear gap that we can draw in between. From there, what we want to see is buyers. From there, what we want to see is heroes or villains contest that area and then get pushed away. However, if the complete opposite happens, and instead heroes or villains contest that area and they bust through it, especially with overwhelming force, that area then becomes stolen land and it now belongs to the opposing team. So from there, what we want to see happen is we want to see the guys who just got their land stolen. So we want to see the heroes or villains who just got their land stolen attempt to come back down, and they're trying to take the fight to the guys who took the land from them in the first place. We want to attempt to see them come back down and get rejected off of that new stolen land by those villains or those heroes that took it from them in the first place. Okay? That is what an inverse fair value gap is, and that's what a fair value gap is. Write that down. Write those 2 things down. The only time a inverse fair value gap becomes void is if so at this point, the land has just been stolen. If that group that is attempting to regain control of that land that just got took from them, if they're able to come back down underneath that area and close underneath that area, so they're able to come back underneath that area, just throw the gap away. You don't need it anymore. It does not matter. Okay? Throw it away. You don't need it. Simple as that. You got that? So write that down. But that's going to be it for this video because it's getting a little long. I've already been recording for an hour and 10 minutes now and 27 seconds. I don't know how I'm going to edit this video, but if you're still a little confused and you need some hand holding, look in the description. There is a link to my Discord channel. Go ahead and join up, and somebody in the community will be more than willing to help you. Or you can book a one-on-one with me. It should be the link underneath that, and we can hop on a Zoom call and I'll hold your hand through whatever questions it is that you have. I will break them down to you in simpler, less nerdy terms, okay? I don't like to do all that nerd shiz. I understand that nerd stuff, but like, it doesn't need to be that overcomplicated, bro, okay? So once again, leave us, click the links in the description, drop a subscription, hit the subscribe button, and leave a like. And if you have any questions, just comment them in the comment section, and I'll try to reply to you. But with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next video.